This is a Chinese export trunk. It's made of dark green leather on camphor wood and would have been made in one of the Chinese ports for sale to Westerners passing through to take home. And as you can see, it's a perfect height for use as a coffee table, or it could go at the end of a bed. A very practical piece of furniture. So let's talk to you a little bit more about this and how we know that it's Chinese export. Well, anyone who's interested in Chinese export furniture and decorative arts have probably seen this book by Carl Grossman, The Decorative Arts of the China Trade. It's very useful. And I'm going to first of all read you a passage from this, a quote, which sums up this trunk quite nicely. The quote is from Osmond Tiffany of Boston in 1844, and he's talking about one of the carpenters' shops, one of the cabinet makers' shops in Carpenters Square, called Canton. So to read from the quote: "We hear the sound of hammers and the grating of swords, smell camphor wood strongly, and find ourselves in the Carpenters Square. 3 or 4 streets, joined together and forming a sort of parallelogram, are wholly occupied by these artisans. Here they are making every variety of furniture, working well and cheaply. The most conspicuous articles are the camphor wood trunks, so admirably adapted for keeping woolens secure from insects. Ailing has a large establishment comprising 4 or 5 shops filled with workmen, and when you order a big trunk, he pulls out his rule, says hiya, and sends a trunk smooth, varnished and fragrant round to the Hong, punctual to the moment." So how do we know that this is Chinese export rather than, say, an English trunk? Well, of course, years of experience in dealing means that you automatically recognise such trunks. But there are lots of other clues as well. So in that text, the fragrant smell of camphor was mentioned a couple of times. And if we open the trunk up and take a deep breath, then we immediately get that strong smell. And that's a really large pointer that it's Chinese export. Now, a really obvious pointer is this little maker's label here, which is quite worn, but it says Ashu. And he is a maker that Carl Grossman notes in his book as having worked in Carpenters Square. Added to that, this paper lining the inside of a trunk is very typically Chinese export. While we've got it open, we can see the lock. The lock is actually English, but it's not uncommon to find English locks on Chinese export trunks. This strap has been replaced at some stage, but it would have had something similar to that. So going back to the outside of the trunk and having a look at it, well, all of this close stud work is typically Chinese export. English studs would normally be perhaps a little bit bigger, and there'd be more of a gap between them, as is the brass corners and the brass edging all the way around. That's more typical of Chinese export. The ring handle, this swag to decorate the front and studs, and this shield-shaped escutcheon. So if I just quickly bring in an English trunk by Thomas Hanford, who worked in the early to mid-19th century on the Strand in London, we can immediately see the difference in the size of the studs and also the gap between them. We can also see it's got brass corners, but it doesn't have edging. It does have a ring pull handle, but although similar, it is different. Handles to the sides. Chinese export ones are normally always going to have brass carrying handles, like this one, whereas most English trunks, but not all of them, will have iron carrying engines. So there's a few quick pointers for you. Now, these trunks came in a variety of sizes, and quite often you could buy a set which would stack up nicely on top of each other, graduating in size. And it wasn't uncommon for somebody to buy a set and for the trunks to be able to pack inside one another, rather like a Russian doll, and then the smallest trunk, perhaps to the centre, would also be packed out with tea, just to maximise the use of space on board a busy merchant ship or East India Company ship going back to America or to Europe. So this is green leather on camphor wood. You also get them quite commonly in black leather. Probably green and black are the two most common colours. Red is another colour, but you don't see that very often. And occasionally you'll also see them decorated with paintwork. So you might have a floral design painted to the trunk, just to further enhance it. You also get Chinese export trunks that don't have leather on them. They're plain, finished camphor wood. So this is a nice example for its size, which is very practical for modern use, as I said before, for use as a coffee table or the end of a bed. But there's one other reason that it stands out, and that is these feet. Most Chinese export trunks that you'll see don't have little turned feet like this. Let's tip it up and have a closer look at them. So you can see that we've got runners on a base here just to lift it off, and these feet unscrew and are removable. So for the journey back home from the Chinese port back to the west, these feet would have been removed and put inside the trunk for travel. It's quite a nice touch having them. They're nicely turned. Let's just show you the shape a little bit closer there. And they just lift the trunk off the floor, making it a little bit easier on the eye and a little bit more comfortable in the way it sits. So, there you go. A Chinese export trunk. Probably bought by a Westerner and sent back to Europe or to America for use. Or sometimes they were bought in bulk by European trunk makers, British, English trunk makers, and resold. We can see some marks at the top here. This one originally would have had an engraved nameplate to it. That's been removed at some stage. There's just a little bit of evidence there of where it would have sat. So, a green leather on camphor wood, Chinese export trunk by the maker Ashu, who was working from the early to mid 19th century in Carpenters Square. And a very nice example.